Most people waste years trying to explain themselves to people who have already decided who they are. A conversation ends, but your mind keeps going. You replay what you said, rethink the sentence that came out wrong, and wonder whether one clearer explanation might finally make them see what you actually meant. So you explain again, more carefully this time. Maybe you give more details, soften your words, remind them of everything they have overlooked. But somewhere along the way, the purpose changes. You are no longer trying to communicate what happened. You are trying to change the way another person has chosen to see you. And that is when a simple misunderstanding begins taking something from you. Your attention, your peace, and eventually your ability to trust your own judgment. What makes this so difficult is that another person's opinion can begin to feel like evidence about who you are. A careless accusation stays in your mind long after genuine praise has faded. Someone says you have changed, and suddenly you wonder whether your growth has made you selfish. Someone calls you arrogant, and you start questioning whether confidence has gone too far. The mind wants to correct the image because being understood feels like being accepted, and being misjudged can feel like a threat to your identity. You can clarify your intentions, you can admit when you are wrong, you can repair what you have damaged. What you cannot do is enter another person's mind and decide what they will believe about you. That distinction changes more than the way you handle arguments. It changes the way you move through relationships. You begin noticing how often you explain things that never needed explaining, how quickly you soften a boundary because someone might dislike it, and how easily you question yourself simply because another person sees you differently. Some people will remember an older version of you. Some will misunderstand your intentions. Some may never understand you at all. Peace begins when you can accept that without feeling compelled to abandon yourself just to be seen correctly. Think about how much of your emotional energy can disappear into a single misunderstanding. Someone says something about you that feels completely wrong, and almost immediately your mind begins constructing a defense. You remember what you actually meant, what happened before the conversation, what you could have said differently, and what the other person must have misunderstood. The conversation may have lasted 5 minutes, but your mind keeps returning to it long after it ends. You replay the details while walking, eating, working, or lying in bed, searching for the sentence that could have changed everything. Then you explain yourself, but they still do not accept your explanation, so you explain again. At some point, communication has quietly turned into a trial, and you have become both the defendant and the lawyer. This is where a subtle psychological shift takes place. You are no longer simply trying to communicate what happened. You are trying to control another person's conclusion about you. That distinction matters because communication is within your influence, while interpretation belongs to another mind. You can choose your words carefully. You can speak honestly, clarify what you meant, admit what you did wrong, and make a sincere effort to rep to. But why does being misunderstood hurt so much in the first place? Because underneath the desire to explain yourself is often something deeper than communication. There is a desire to be recognized, accepted, and confirmed. You do not simply want the other person to understand what you said. You want them to understand who you are. That is why a small accusation can sometimes feel like an attack on your identity. If someone calls you selfish, you do not hear only a criticism of one action. You begin wondering whether they have discovered something terrible about you. If someone calls you arrogant after you become more confident, you start questioning whether your confidence has actually become arrogance. If someone says you have changed, you may immediately feel guilty for becoming different. Yet the Stoics would force a harder question. What part of this reaction belongs to reality, and what part belongs to your attachment to reputation? There is a difference between examining criticism and surrendering to it. You should be willing to ask whether you acted wrongly, because character matters more than pride. But once you have honestly examined your conduct, you do not need to keep putting yourself on trial simply because someone refuses to accept your answer. Your responsibility is to correct what is genuinely wrong, not to achieve universal agreement about your worth. Air what has been damaged. After that, something remains outside your hands. The other person may accept your explanation, reject it, misunderstand it, or continue believing something that you know is incomplete. None of those reactions can be commanded into existence. The Stoic discipline begins precisely here, in recognizing the boundary between your responsibility and everything beyond it. That does not mean misunderstanding is harmless, or that you should become indifferent whenever someone sees you incorrectly. Sometimes an explanation is necessary. A careless statement can damage trust. A false assumption can create distance between people who genuinely care about each other. There are moments when remaining silent would be less wise than speaking clearly. Seneca captured this discipline when he wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." The mind can turn a misunderstanding into something far larger than the moment itself, especially when we begin imagining how another person sees us, what they might think, or what their judgment might mean for the relationship. Stoic discipline is not a refusal to communicate. It is a refusal to confuse communication with control. You explain because honesty requires explanation, not because you are entitled to a particular response afterward. You apologize because your actions deserve correction, not because an apology guarantees forgiveness. You clarify because the relationship matters, not because you can force another person to adopt your version of events. The difficulty appears when being understood becomes necessary for your emotional stability. You notice it when someone's opinion follows you long after the conversation is over. Their judgment starts becoming a question you repeatedly ask yourself. Did they really mean that? Do they think I am selfish? Do they still respect me? Should I have said something different? Maybe I should send another message. Maybe I should explain the whole situation from the beginning. A simple disagreement begins occupying an unreasonable amount of mental space. The mind keeps returning because it believes one more explanation will finally produce relief. But relief does not come, because the real problem is no longer the misunderstanding. The real problem is your attachment to resolving another person's perception of you. Once your peace depends on their interpretation, they have acquired influence over a part of your mind that was supposed to remain yours. You may still believe you are acting independently, yet your attention is being directed by their judgment. You become careful around them, not because caution is wise, but because you are anticipating how everything might be interpreted. You change your tone. You edit your reactions. You monitor your facial expressions. You begin explaining ordinary choices before anyone has even questioned them. Slowly, you stop responding to the situation itself and start responding to an imagined audience inside your head. That is exhausting because there is no final answer. A person who needs to be understood perfectly must constantly manage perception, and perception is always moving. Consider how easily this can happen in an ordinary relationship. Someone says that you have changed. Instead of calmly considering whether the change is healthy, your first instinct may be to prove that you are still the same person. You list the reasons for your decisions. You explain what you have been dealing with. You remind them of everything you have done for them. Perhaps none of it changes their view. Now you are left with a strange feeling that you failed, even though you may have done nothing wrong. The failure existed only in your inability to make another person see you differently. That is a dangerous standard because it turns your character into something that must constantly be approved by other minds. A more grounded approach begins with a quieter examination. Before defending yourself, look honestly at what happened. Was your behavior consistent with the principles you claim to value? Did you act unfairly? Did you speak carelessly? Did pride make you dismiss something worth hearing? If the answer is yes, then correction is stronger than defensiveness. You do not become weaker by admitting an error. You become harder to manipulate because your identity does not depend on pretending to be flawless. But if you examine the situation carefully and find that the accusation does not fit the facts, you also do not need to spend hours trying to erase it from another person's mind. You can let the disagreement remain unresolved without allowing it to become a judgment against your entire character. If this way of thinking gives you a little more clarity, consider subscribing. This is a way to stay connected to these reflections and return whenever you need a quieter place to examine your judgment, strengthen your discipline, and remember what is still within your control. This is one of the harder forms of self-control because the mind naturally wants closure. It wants the other person to say they understand. It wants the tension to disappear. It wants the final conversation, the perfect explanation, the moment when everything becomes clear. Sometimes that moment comes, sometimes it does not. Your task is to remain steady in both situations. You can leave a conversation knowing that you were honest, even if you were not believed. You can walk away from an accusation without carrying it home with you. You can accept that another person has the right to form an opinion, even when that opinion is unfair. Their freedom to judge does not create an obligation for you to live according to their judgment. That steadiness matters because your mind becomes quieter when it stops demanding a verdict from people who may never give one. You remain answerable to yourself, not their approval. That is where freedom begins. Being misunderstood hurts because it rarely feels like a simple disagreement about facts. It can feel like someone has reached into the private place where you keep your sense of who you are and returned with the wrong answer. A person says you are selfish, and suddenly you are not thinking only about what you did. You are examining your entire character. Someone calls you arrogant, and instead of considering one behavior, you begin questioning whether your confidence has become something ugly. Someone says you have changed, and a strange guilt appears, as though becoming different automatically means you have become worse. The accusation may be only a sentence, but the mind can turn it into a verdict. That reaction becomes stronger because human beings naturally want their inner experience to be recognized by others. We want our intentions to be visible. We want people to know that the silence had a reason, that the distance was necessary, that the decision came from careful thought rather than selfishness. Being understood can feel like confirmation that our version of ourselves is real. Being misunderstood can therefore feel like a threat to identity. The mind starts reaching outward for reassurance. You explain what happened. You provide details. You mention things the other person forgot. You remind them of your past behavior. You search for evidence that proves your character. For a moment, this can feel productive. Then you notice that the other person is still unconvinced, and the need to explain becomes even stronger. This is where a subtle trap appears. You can begin treating another person's opinion as evidence about yourself simply because they expressed it with confidence. Their certainty starts borrowing authority. If they sound convinced that you are selfish, perhaps you really are. If they insist that you have become arrogant, perhaps your confidence is misplaced. If several people react negatively to a change in your behavior, perhaps you should return to the version of yourself that made everyone comfortable. But criticism and truth are not the same thing. A judgment can contain useful information without becoming an accurate definition of your character. It can also be completely wrong. The difficult part is learning to examine it without either worshipping it or rejecting it automatically. But the process must also have an ending. Once you have examined your conduct honestly, you cannot keep reopening the case simply because someone else refuses to accept your conclusion. This is where many people lose their peace. They think self-reflection means endless self-suspicion. It does not. Reflection should make your judgment clearer, not keep you permanently on trial. If you acted badly, repair what you can. If you spoke carelessly, apologize. If you hurt someone, take responsibility. Then learn from it and continue. If you acted with reasonable care and your intentions were honest, you may still be disliked. You may still be criticized. You may still be misunderstood. None of those outcomes automatically mean that you failed. The distinction becomes especially important when reputation enters the picture. Reputation is built in other people's minds, and minds are not under your command. You can influence how you behave, but you cannot completely control how that behavior will be interpreted. One person sees confidence and another sees arrogance. One person sees independence and another sees distance. One person sees patience and another sees weakness. The same action can produce completely different impressions because people bring their own experiences, fears, expectations, and assumptions into what they observe. Expecting one universal interpretation is therefore an impossible demand. If you make your peace dependent on everyone reaching the same conclusion about you, you have created a problem that cannot be solved. This does not mean you should stop caring about how your actions affect others. That would be an easy excuse for selfishness disguised as inner freedom. Psychological strength is not the ability to dismiss every criticism. It is the ability to remain open without becoming controlled. Listen carefully. Consider the evidence. Separate the useful part from the emotional noise. Then decide what deserves a response. Someone may tell you that your behavior hurt them, and that deserves attention, even if their interpretation of your motives is inaccurate. Someone may accuse you of something you did not do, and that does not require you to accept their story as your identity. The mature response lives between defensiveness and submission. This balance requires real discipline. Once you understand that another person's judgment does not have to become your identity, you begin noticing how quickly people turn each other into simple characters. A person becomes the quiet one, the reliable one, the difficult one, the funny one, the sensitive one, the responsible one, the one who always says yes, or the one who never complains. Repetition gives these descriptions weight. People eventually respond to the version of you they already know. Your past becomes a filter through which your present is interpreted. That can create a strange kind of pressure. You may want to change, but the people around you have become comfortable with your old behavior. If you suddenly become more disciplined, someone may call you obsessive. If you stop accepting disrespect, someone may say you have become difficult. If you become less available, someone may accuse you of no longer caring. Sometimes those reactions are unfair. Sometimes they contain useful information. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Their reactions may tell you something worth considering, but they do not get to decide what those reactions mean or who you should become. The important thing is that neither reaction should automatically determine your behavior. You have to examine the situation for yourself. A label can be informative without becoming a command. Think about how easily this happens in ordinary relationships. If you have always been the person who solves everyone's problems, people may naturally come to you whenever something goes wrong. At first, helping feels meaningful. Then you become tired and start saying no. Suddenly, your refusal feels like a change in character to the people who benefited from your constant availability. They may simply be surprised that the familiar arrangement is disappearing. Their reaction can still feel personal because they are responding to a version of you that no longer exists. This is where psychological independence becomes important. You cannot build your identity around remaining predictable to everyone else. If you do, growth becomes frightening because every change risks disappointing someone. You start asking whether a decision will make people uncomfortable before asking whether it is reasonable, honest, or consistent with your values. You choose the safer response because it protects an established image. You keep giving because people expect it. You stay quiet because speaking honestly might disturb the atmosphere. You agree because disagreement could change how someone sees you. Nothing dramatic happens in a single moment. The division happens gradually. The Stoic approach gives you a different standard for deciding how to act. Instead of asking which version of yourself will create the least resistance, you ask what conduct is worthy of your principles. Their reactions can provide information without becoming the foundation of your character. If someone tells you that you have become colder, you can examine whether you have actually become careless. If they say you are selfish, you can consider whether you have stopped caring or merely stopped sacrificing yourself unnecessarily. If they say you have changed, you can admit that you have. Change itself is not evidence of failure. There is also a quieter danger in trying to remain recognizable. You can become so skilled at meeting expectations that you lose contact with your own judgment. You know how to make everyone comfortable, but you are no longer sure what makes you comfortable. You know how to avoid conflict, but have forgotten how to disagree. You know how to be dependable, but you feel guilty whenever you need support yourself. The role becomes easier to perform than the person is to understand. Eventually, you may receive plenty of approval while carrying a growing sense that your life is being organized around other people's expectations. That internal division often appears as resentment. You may feel people take too much from you while you continue offering it. You may believe others do not respect boundaries you rarely state. You may resent that nobody appreciates how much you do while continuing to do things you no longer want to do. In those situations, blaming everyone else can feel satisfying, but it does not solve the deeper problem. If you repeatedly abandon your own judgment in order to preserve approval, part of the responsibility belongs to you. That is an opportunity for freedom, because what belongs partly to you can be changed by you. This is why becoming more authentic requires more than simply ignoring people's opinions. You need enough self-awareness to distinguish between social pressure and legitimate correction. A person who refuses all criticism is not necessarily independent. They may simply be protecting their ego. Real independence allows another person to speak without automatically surrendering your judgment. You listen, you consider, you decide. Sometimes you change your behavior because the criticism reveals something you had not noticed. Other times, you keep your position because the criticism reflects someone else's expectations rather than a real problem in your conduct. Either way, the decision becomes yours again. And what happens when you spend years adjusting yourself to other people's expectations? At first, the adjustments can feel harmless. You change your tone around certain people. You hold back an opinion because the timing seems wrong. You laugh at something that bothered you because explaining it would create tension. You agree to plans you do not want because saying no feels unnecessarily difficult. None of these moments seems important enough to question, but they accumulate. After enough time, you may become tired without knowing exactly what is exhausting you. It is not always the conversation itself. Sometimes it is the constant performance underneath it, the quiet effort required to predict reactions, manage impressions, and keep everyone comfortable with the version of you they already know. You begin monitoring yourself from the outside. Before speaking, you consider how the words might sound. After speaking, you replay them. Around one person, you become quieter. Around another, more agreeable. Around someone else, you become careful not to appear too confident, too distant, too emotional, or too demanding. Your personality starts changing according to the room, and eventually the adjustments become automatic. You may even mistake this flexibility for kindness or maturity. Sometimes it is. Knowing how to read a situation can be a useful social skill. The problem begins when adaptation becomes self-abandonment, when keeping the peace repeatedly requires you to ignore your own judgment. You are no longer simply choosing how to behave. You are managing perception, hoping that if you perform correctly, nobody will have a reason to reject you. That kind of living creates a strange psychological fatigue because there is no moment when the performance is completely finished. Even when you are alone, you may continue thinking about how you were perceived. A conversation from the afternoon follows you into the evening. You wonder whether someone misunderstood your tone or noticed your hesitation. You imagine what they might be saying about you. Then you begin preparing for the next interaction before it even happens. Your attention becomes occupied with an audience that may not even be thinking about you anymore. This is one of the hidden costs of needing approval. You give other people space in your mind long after they have left the room. This is where Stoic discipline adds an important correction to the idea of authenticity. Being authentic does not mean obeying every impulse simply because the impulse feels genuine. Anger can be genuine and still be destructive. Withdrawal can feel honest and still be cowardice. Speaking your mind can feel liberating and still be needlessly cruel. A person can sincerely feel offended and still be wrong about what another person intended. The goal is not to remove every social mask and become whatever emotion happens to rise inside you. The deeper goal is to develop enough self-command that you no longer need a false identity to survive, while also refusing to let raw emotion become your master. That distinction protects you from another trap. After years of suppressing yourself, you may suddenly discover the language of boundaries and decide that freedom means saying exactly what you think, refusing anything uncomfortable, and cutting off anyone who challenges you. But if your behavior is still being controlled by other people, only the direction has changed. Before, you shaped yourself to gain approval. Now, you may shape yourself around proving that nobody controls you. Both patterns keep your attention fixed on the reactions of others. Real self-command is quieter. You can say no without needing the other person to feel guilty. You can say yes without secretly expecting gratitude. You can disagree without turning disagreement into a battle over identity. You can admit weakness without believing that weakness defines you. You can hear criticism without immediately becoming defensive, and you can reject unfair criticism without needing to punish the person who offered it. As Epictetus taught, no man is free who is not master of himself. That kind of freedom requires you to remain present with your emotions without surrendering your decisions to them. You begin creating a small space between what you feel and what you do. Inside that space, judgment becomes possible. You can notice fear without obeying it, feel anger without feeding it, and experience disappointment without turning it into a decision. That is where deliberate action begins. And that distinction quietly changes how you live. The more that space grows, the less you need the mask to protect you. You no longer have to perform strength because you can tolerate being seen as imperfect. You do not need to appear endlessly agreeable because you can tolerate someone's disappointment. You do not need to appear intelligent because you can admit that you do not know something. You do not need to be dependable every second because your worth does not disappear when you need help. Someone may say that you are different. They may be right. But difference is not automatically betrayal. Sometimes it is evidence that an old role has stopped fitting. And this is where being misunderstood becomes less frightening. You can allow another person to think you are cold without becoming cold. You can allow them to think you are selfish while continuing to act with fairness. You can accept that someone may prefer the older version of you without returning to it simply to restore their comfort. As Epictetus taught, it is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows. That reminder applies here as much to self-judgment as it does to the judgments of others. Your task is to keep examining your conduct. If you become harsh, correct it. If you become selfish, correct it. If you become avoidant, face what you are avoiding. But do not confuse someone else's discomfort with proof that you have done something wrong. A mask falls away properly when you replace performance with principle. You become honest without becoming reckless, firm without becoming cruel, independent without becoming isolated, and calm enough to let people misunderstand you without turning their misunderstanding into your identity. Then you begin seeing relationships differently. Some people genuinely want to know you, while others may be attached primarily to the role you play in their lives. You may have become the listener, the rescuer, the person who always forgives, the person who never says no, or the one who constantly provides reassurance. These roles can feel like love because they often begin with good intentions. You help because you care. You listen because someone needs you. You forgive because holding resentment feels exhausting. But when a role becomes expected, something changes. What was once freely given starts becoming socially required. And the moment you stop providing it, the relationship may suddenly feel different. That change can be painful because it forces you to separate genuine connection from familiarity. A person may not be trying to control you. If you were always available, your absence feels strange. If you always solved problems, your refusal feels like rejection. If you constantly absorbed someone's frustration, your decision to step back may seem uncaring. Their reaction can still hurt, but it does not automatically prove that they are jealous, manipulative, or threatened by your growth. Sometimes people are simply responding to a pattern that has changed. Sometimes they need time to adjust. Sometimes the relationship needs a new form. Because the old one depended on behavior you can no longer honestly continue. This is where discernment becomes more useful than resentment. Resentment wants a villain. It wants a simple explanation for why someone reacted badly, because labeling them makes the situation easier to understand. If they are selfish, everything is explained. If they are insecure, their criticism can be dismissed. But human relationships are rarely that simple. You can be treated unfairly by someone who still cares about you. Someone can misunderstand your intentions without secretly wanting to harm you. You can also contribute to a conflict without realizing it. A mature mind has enough strength to hold these possibilities at the same time. The Stoic response is to observe carefully what actually happened. What did the other person say or do, rather than what did you assume they meant? What part of the tension came from their expectations, and what part came from your behavior? Did you communicate your boundary clearly, or did you disappear and expect them to understand? Did you become more honest, or did you become unnecessarily harsh because you were tired of accommodating people? These distinctions matter because psychological independence is not the same as always believing yourself to be right. It means you can examine yourself without immediately collapsing into guilt or rushing into self-defense. You may discover that a relationship has been built around a version of you that no longer feels honest. Perhaps you were always the person who answered late-night calls, solved problems, offered endless reassurance, or accepted apologies without seeing any real change. When you begin stepping back, the other person may become upset. Their disappointment is real, but it does not automatically make your boundary wrong. They are allowed to feel hurt. You are allowed to choose differently. Both realities can exist without either person becoming the enemy. This becomes especially important when relationships change because of personal growth. You may become more disciplined, more private, less reactive, or more protective of your time. Someone close to you might interpret this as distance. They may prefer the version of you who was easier to reach, easier to persuade, or more willing to tolerate things that you now recognize as unhealthy. Sometimes it is, but assuming that too quickly can create another form of blindness. Perhaps they miss the closeness you once shared. Perhaps your new behavior really has become colder than you intended. Growth still requires self-examination. That is why you do not need to make every conflict evidence that someone is against you. A relationship can contain disagreement without becoming a battle. Someone can challenge you without controlling you. Someone can disappoint you without being toxic. Someone can fail to understand you without being your enemy. When you stop turning every uncomfortable interaction into a verdict about the other person's character, you become much harder to pull into unnecessary emotional conflict. You can listen without surrendering. You can listen to their disappointment without making it your identity. And when you stop needing every relationship to confirm your choices, your relationships become strangely more honest. You are no longer staying because you are afraid of being misunderstood, and you are no longer leaving simply because someone disagreed with you. You are observing more carefully, responding more deliberately, and allowing people to reveal themselves without rushing to define them. That is a quieter kind of strength. It does not require enemies, dramatic exits, or constant proof. It requires enough inner steadiness to let a relationship change without letting that change decide the kind of person you will be. This does not mean silence is always wise. Silence can come from fear, avoidance, resentment, or an unwillingness to face something uncomfortable. Speaking can sometimes be the more disciplined choice. If someone has genuinely misunderstood an important matter, you may owe them an explanation. If your actions caused harm, responsibility may require more than quiet acceptance. The point is to understand why you are speaking before you speak. Are you trying to make the situation clearer, or are you trying to make another person's discomfort disappear? Those motives can look almost identical from the outside, but they lead to different outcomes. You can speak clearly without demanding agreement. Consider what happens when you keep explaining after the useful information has already been given. You explain the reason behind your decision, then you explain why you made that decision. Eventually, the conversation stops being about the original issue. It becomes an attempt to manage their perception of you. You may think you are defending your truth, but underneath that defense can be a quieter demand. Please see me correctly. Please remove the uncertainty this conversation created inside me. Your peace cannot depend on winning that private argument. The more important that confirmation becomes, the more power their reaction gains. This is why restraint can be more powerful than another explanation. You can say what needs to be said and allow the other person to decide. That requires accepting an uncomfortable possibility. They may still misunderstand you. They may disagree with your reasons. They may continue telling themselves a story about you that you consider inaccurate. Your instinct may be to keep pushing until their resistance breaks, but that is where self-control becomes relevant. The Stoic approach makes this distinction especially clear because it places judgment before reaction. An impression appears, emotion follows, and then the mind has a choice about what to do with both. Someone says something unfair, and anger rises. The feeling itself is not a moral failure. As Aristotle observed, anyone can become angry, that is easy, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not easy. You can notice the anger without letting it write the message, choose the words, or determine the length of the argument. Sometimes the strongest response is a calm explanation. Sometimes it is a brief correction. Sometimes it is silence. You remain free to choose your response carefully. The strength comes from choosing rather than reacting. This also changes how you receive criticism. When you no longer need to defend yourself automatically, you can finally listen. You become more capable of understanding others. A criticism that once felt like an attack can become information you are free to examine. The person may be wrong, or they may have noticed something you did not. You can separate the useful part from the rest. If you find that you were wrong, you can admit it without feeling that your identity has collapsed. If the criticism is unfair, you can reject it without spending the day trying to prove that you are innocent. That ability keeps criticism from becoming either a weapon or a blind spot. That is a much deeper form of confidence than simply believing everyone else is wrong. Anyone can protect their ego by dismissing criticism. Real confidence allows the possibility of being mistaken without becoming terrified of it. You can say, "I was wrong," and still remain steady. You can say, "I disagree," and still remain respectful. You can understand why someone sees it that way without adopting their conclusion. A person who does not need to be perfect has far less reason to manipulate perception. You can remain open without becoming emotionally exposed to every opinion. As this becomes natural, your conversations begin changing. You stop filling silence because you are afraid of what silence might communicate. You stop adding explanations after someone has already heard you. You stop arguing simply because someone has the wrong opinion of you. More importantly, you begin listening without preparing a defense. Carl Jung captured something essential about this inner shift when he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Instead of treating every uncomfortable reaction as something that must be defeated, you begin observing what it reveals, both about the other person and about yourself. That makes your presence calmer. People can feel when someone is desperately trying to control an interaction. You do not need to dominate the room. You do not need to win the interpretation. You simply remain present. Presence grows when your attention stays with reality instead of imagined judgment. And there is something liberating about knowing that your character can survive another person's misunderstanding. You can walk away without solving everything. Keep your conduct clear. Correct what deserves correction. Explain what genuinely needs explanation. Apologize when you have caused harm. Then stop carrying what belongs to another person's judgment. The goal is to become less dependent on their conclusions. Once that dependence weakens, your mind becomes quieter, your reactions become more deliberate, and your attention returns to the only place where it can actually do something useful, the way you choose to live. That is where composure becomes real. You do not need to convince everyone of who you are. Let your actions speak where words no longer can. Let your character remain steady when opinions change, and let misunderstanding pass without taking your peace with it. The freedom you are looking for may begin the moment you stop asking to be seen correctly and start becoming someone you can respect when no one else understands. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal. If you want to continue, choose one of the suggested videos on the screen and keep walking the path toward greater discipline, clarity, and peace.